Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Rosenblum. I am the co-director of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, IDRH, at the University of Kansas. And I want to thank everyone who is joining us today from KU and from afar for this first event of our 2021-2022 Digital Storytelling Colloquium featuring Professor Michelle Caswell. The colloquium is a series of virtual public events focused on the ethics, politics, and techniques of digital storytelling. Stretched over the length of the academic year, the colloquium features speakers and projects from across the KU campus and across the world, and explores the theory and practice, opportunities and challenges of digital storytelling. Across all these events, the vision of the colloquium is to build a community of inquiry and an incubator for ideas. The colloquium also runs in conjunction with our Digital Humanities Fellows program. The DH Fellows are a cohort of 10 faculty members and students from across the university committed to thinking and working together for an academic year. Fellows will share and develop research projects, discuss readings, take part in workshops, and receive guidance and consultation on their projects from IDRH staff. They also have the opportunity for deeper engagement with our colloquium speakers, including Professor Caswell tomorrow in a smaller collaborative setting. And we have just selected our 10 scholars with outstanding projects to serve as DH Fellows for the year. And this is the first event of this year's program for them as well. So welcome, Fellows. Our session today will last an hour. There will be some time after the talk for Q&A. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions, and we will monitor those and direct them to Professor Caswell, whom it is now my pleasure to introduce. Michelle Caswell is an associate professor of archival studies in the Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She directs a team of students at UCLA's Community Archives Lab, which explores the ways that independent identity-based memory organizations document, shape, and provide access to the histories of minoritized communities, with a particular emphasis on understanding their affective, political, and artistic impact. In 2008, she co-founded the South Asian American Digital Archive, an online repository that documents and provides access to the stories of South Asian Americans. And in her 2014 book, Archiving the Unspeakable, Silence, Memory, and the Photographic Record in Cambodia, Professor Caswell uses an archival lens and contemporary archival theory to trace the ongoing social life of mugshots taken by the Khmer Rouge of prisoners before they were sent to the killing fields to be murdered. Originally created as administrative records for the regime, these photographs have since become agents of silence and witnessing in museum exhibitions, archival collections, and databases. And I'll just add that we discussed this book last year in our DH reading group and found it really fascinating. The topic, of course, itself, but also the way Michelle brings archival theory to bear on these other fields of studies: human rights, memory studies, Southeast Asian studies. Her most recent book, Urgent Archives, Enacting Liberatory Memory Work, was published by Routledge earlier this year. It explores how members of minoritized communities activate records to build solidarities across and within communities and disrupt cycles of oppression. And that is the title and subject of her talk today. So without further ado, Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today. We're thrilled to have you here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian, for that introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just delighted to be here, or at least to be there virtually today. I'm always advocating that there should be more exchange between archivists, archival studies scholars, and digital humanists. So I'm really just excited that some of you have read my work and that you invited me today. I join you today from UCLA, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, which you might know as Los Angeles. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and we will not have any more technical difficulties today, I hope. Here we go. The title of my talk is Urgent Archives, Enacting Liberatory Memory Work, which, as Brian said, is based on my book of the same title, which came out last May from Routledge Press. I really can't believe that I somehow managed to write a book in the middle of a pandemic with a 5-year-old son and a partner who's an emergency physician. So every time I see this, I'm still quite surprised, even though it's quite slim, that I managed to pull it off. Specifically, today's presentation is from chapter 3, which is called From Representation to Liberation. So my previous work has addressed the ways in which marginalized or minoritized identity-based community archives counter what's called the symbolic annihilation of oppressed communities. That is the way that predominantly white university and government archives have underrepresented, misrepresented, or completely ignored BIPOC communities and LGBTQ+ communities. I've posited that community archives counter symbolic annihilation with what I termed representational belonging, empowering people who have been minoritized by mainstream media outlets and memory institutions to have the autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and ultimately positive to them in a variety of symbolic contexts. So this presentation will build on and go beyond these previous findings using recent projects by the South Asian American Digital Archive, which I'll refer to by its acronym SAADA, as examples. So more specifically, it will address the relationship between liberatory appraisal and liberatory outreach in community archives, arguing that community archives should build on recuperative and representational collecting initiatives to activate records to stop cycles of oppression. I'll introduce a new concept, corollary records, to show how records from similar moments in history can be activated in the present. I'll also argue that more robust and accurate representation of minoritized communities is a limited and limiting end goal for community archives, however important it is, and it is important. I argue that community archives must aim for more than representation, leveraging the minoritized histories they have painstakingly recuperated for liberatory ends. Through strategic outreach with activists, artists, and other community members, archivists can ensure the records in their care are activated to stop oppression in the present. Ultimately, I argue that community archives must pair liberatory appraisal with liberatory activation in order to resist the white temporal imaginary. I'll also touch a little bit in closing on what archival studies can offer digital humanities and vice versa, and make a case that we all need to be in better conversation with each other. And I'm so glad that you've already started that conversation there. But first, I want to clarify what I mean when I say community archives, because it's kind of a slippery term. Diverging from centuries of archival thinking about government and bureaucratic records, the past decade has seen the rapid expansion of inquiries into what we now call community archives, such that community archives, I think, is at the forefront of the most interesting work that is being done in archival studies. While just 10 or 15 years ago, there was very little literature about community archives. And in fact, when I told one of my professors when I was a graduate student that I was working on a community archive, his response was that community archives don't exist in the US. I don't think anybody could make that claim anymore. So the first attempts to describe the community archives phenomenon emerged from the UK. Writing in 2009, Andrew Flynn, Mary Stevens, and Elizabeth Shepherd write, quote, "A community is any group of people who come together and present themselves as such, and a community archive is the product of their attempts to document the history of their commonality." The same research team wrote, quote, "The defining characteristic of community archives is the active participation of a community in documenting and making accessible the history of their particular group and or locality on their own terms." And that's the most important part, I think, of the definition, on their own terms, right? So the community that is being represented in the records is also the community that's doing the archival labor, right? So this definition is a really good first start of a definition, but I think it requires some refinement in our current American context. So I think that we can't discuss community archives in the US without addressing power inequities. So here, I think we can broadly divide community archives into two categories: those that represent and serve dominant communities, right? So people with dominant identities still have community. Community is not just reserved for minoritized people, right? So those that represent and serve dominant communities, such as some, not all, but some historical societies that are often invested in white supremacist histories as a way to maintain or increase local property values and their relationship with white supremacy. And by contrast, those that represent and serve underrepresented, marginalized, or oppressed communities. And it's this latter group of community archives that I'm interested in, right, that my research addresses. So we might call them more specifically minoritized identity-based community archives, in which the history held in common, at least in part, coalesces around a shared history of oppression, be it white supremacy, hetero-patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, ableism, and their complex intersections. Furthermore, I think it's important to distinguish independent community archives from what we now might call community-driven or community-accountable collecting projects located within dominant institutions like predominantly white universities. And we can discuss more why I think it's important to make that distinction later if you're interested. So to be absolutely clear, when I say community archives, I really mean independent, minoritized, identity-based community archives, which is clunky and doesn't easily translate into an acronym. And another point of clarification before I really get started, although this talk draws on my experiences as a co-founder and ongoing volunteer for and advisor to SAADA, the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is a role I've had for the past 13 years, I have not directly worked on the specific projects discussed herein, other than digitizing some of the collections from which the projects draw and providing some very general feedback. That said, I'm in constant conversation with SAADA's executive director, Sumeet Malik, who's the other co-founder, and I often provide informal advice and ideas on projects and how to implement them. So as such, I cannot, nor do I claim to stand entirely apart from the work addressed in this talk. I make no assertions of being an outside researcher, though I'm definitely a white outsider to the South Asian American community. But I am an integral component of the phenomenon my work describes in a manner consistent with participant observation as a research method, I think. I also cannot claim ownership or take credit for most of the archival labor described herein. So I shift back and forth between saying we when I talk about SAADA, particularly its founding more generally, or they when I talk about discussing the work of SAADA staff who've been hard at work at these projects without my help or intervention in any way. So with all of that said, I'll get started where I usually do, which is with SAADA. So speaking at a July 2020 community-wide open Zoom meeting, SAADA Executive Director Sumeet Malik said, quote, "As an organization, even though we are thinking about and engaging with the past, our work has really always been about the present, the now." The meeting was called by Malik in the midst of three intertwined crises, right? A global pandemic that had disproportionately devastated Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, the ongoing state-sanctioned murder of Black Americans brought to the fore by the murder of George Floyd, and at that point, inept, malfeasant, white supremacist national leadership in the White House. Malik's invitation promised, quote, "We have some good news to share in the midst of this challenging time." And I think we all needed that good news right then. So this July 2020 meeting was an opportunity to celebrate the organization's then 12th birthday, to announce a new grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that would help support the organization for the next 2 years, and to launch a fundraising campaign with supporters. It was also an opportunity to demonstrate the archive's value by drawing on corollary moments from the community's past to make sense of the seemingly senseless and increasingly overwhelming present. At that moment, that meant activating records in SAADA's collections to inspire action around three major issues: the COVID-19 pandemic, the movement for Black lives, and at that point, the then upcoming 2020 presidential election. So there's little doubt we're living through a historic moment, reads the opening text of SAADA's participatory initiative to document South Asian American experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Launched in April 2020, the project, which is called Letters from 6 Feet Away, asks South Asian Americans to write a letter to their future selves about their experiences with the pandemic. With the creator's permission, the letters are included in the archives and mailed to the creator in the future, quote, "in hopefully better days ahead." And it's quite interesting. Initially, the letters were meant to be mailed exactly a year after they were submitted, and that process has been delayed because I think we're not quite clear that we're in the better days ahead yet. Participants respond to a series of prompts online, upload a photograph of themselves, designate degrees of privacy or publicity from a continuum of options provided, and submit a mailing address in which they would like their letters to be sent back to themselves in the future. There's also a space to honor a loved one who might have passed during the crisis. The submissions are deeply personal and self-reflective, yet collectively offer a window into a wider community ethos of grief, feelings of isolation, and the search for solace. In these letters, historic traumas surface and resurface as South Asian Americans learn to cope with the new reality. For example, in her public entry to the project, Samara Ghosh of Texas writes, quote, "I would remember the first news that we needed to store food. My first instinct was to buy rice and salt at Gandhi Bazaar. It was a reaction to a historic trauma that my community went through. Bengal had a big man-made famine post-World War II, and rice and salt were in scarcity. I heard stories of what my family went through. I was surprised that this deep-seated insecurity had resurfaced," end quote. So in this case, the Bengal famine of 1943 emerges as a powerful intergenerational memory being relived, even though the writer herself had not directly experienced it. She continues that getting groceries delivered in the early days of quarantine, quote, "felt like Christmas morning." For some participants, the pandemic surfaced deeply ingrained traumas and enacted circular temporalities, as if history was repeating itself, oceans and decades away in a vastly different context. So these letters are created to be read at a non-corollary moment in the near future, in the hopes that in the future, when the pandemic has presumably subsided, or at least its demands on us are presumably different, that activating these records by reading them will reveal some new insight into what will then be that present moment. The project builds community by providing a platform for letters to be shared with each other, right? Hence the name Letters from 6 Feet Away. But most importantly, it underscores the affective importance of the creation of records to participants. Those who write letters to themselves, I think, feel validated, heard, documented in the historic record, even if they choose not to share their letters with others. In the future, the project then transforms these record creators into records users as participants read their own letters from the not so distant, or hopefully not so distant past. And in so doing, it inaugurates a cyclical temporality, catalyzing movement back and forth along a pendulum, swinging back and forth between now, a year and a half ago, a year and a half from now, maybe. We don't really know yet what that endpoint is. So that's the first project. The second, after inviting attendees of the July 2020 community meeting to participate in the Letters from 6 Feet Away project, Malik then pivoted to the other crisis on everyone's minds, the proliferation of and impunity for state-sponsored violence against Black people. South Asian Americans have a complicated history with the American racial hierarchy, as many records in SAADA attest. Some early immigrants from India align themselves with whiteness to varying degrees of success, while others passed as Black. The 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act that enabled South Asians to immigrate to the US in larger numbers would not have been possible without the civil rights movement. Yet, anti-Black racism remains an ongoing problem within the community, despite the efforts of many, many South Asian American activists. For Malik, the July 2020 meeting was an opportunity to further position SAADA as an organization committed to justice for Black people. Acknowledging complex histories, he drew connections between the ongoing movement for Black lives and corollary moments in history in which South Asian Americans were involved in activism for Black liberation. Yet he also directly confronted anti-Black racism within the community and did not gloss over its history of aspirational misalignment with whiteness. Quote, "In response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, we are sharing stories from our community's past that help engage our community today in the struggle against anti-Black racism," Malik said. He then recounted the story of H.G. Mudgall, featured here in SAADA's blog, Tides. Mudgall was an Indian immigrant to Harlem in the 1920s who became the editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper and an outspoken activist for Black independence. H.G. Mudgall's story, this is what Samib said, quote, "is a reminder both of the historical possibilities and duties for South Asians to engage in solidarity with Black communities, but moreover, the urgency now for us to engage in those solidarities and to address anti-Blackness within our own communities," Malik said. He continued, quote, "to be able to share these stories from the past, To be able to engage with contemporary discourse and dialogue and movements has been really rewarding and enriching for us as an organization, and I hope they help to move our community as well, end quote. So Malik's comments reflect, I think, a temporality of urgency in which records from the past are invoked to inspire contemporary political action. In this way, the 1920s here are set up as a corollary moment to the 2020s, and records documenting H.G. Mudgall from the 1920s are set up as corollary records to those being created by South Asian American activists fighting anti-Black racism now. By catalyzing corollary records from corollary moments, Malik showed precedent for South Asian American solidarity with Black Americans, evoking his term historical possibilities that align the community with the contemporary movement for Black lives. These activations forge a cyclical temporality that dispenses with the racial progress narratives of white time. That's a phrase from Charles Mills, who sadly passed away last week. Instead of insisting that it gets better for minoritized communities, these efforts show how oppressive histories repeat, how historical possibilities can be invoked to forge affinities and solidarities in the present, how a precedent of anti-racist activism can inspire action for Black lives in the now. In this work, archives become urgently relevant and crucially contemporary. The current moment demands more from the archives, I think, than simply documenting these stories of solidarity in hopes that some future users might find them and use them. SAADA catalyzes these records into action to forge corollary moments across cycles of time and to create a temporality of urgency for the communities it serves and represents. So the third project, Malik's final announcement at the July 2020 meeting also conveyed the urgency of the past by forging yet another corollary moment with the present. Looking ahead to the November 2020 US presidential election, Malik discussed a video SAADA produced in May 2020 featuring Rani Bagai, whose grandparents, Vaishno Das and Kala Bagai, were among the first immigrants from India to the US, arriving in 1915. And this is a collection that I did help digitize, and I'm super excited to see it used in this way. So I'm going to play for you a video now that SAADA shared. So I have to share my screen again. It's a 2-minute video.
Why does your vote matter? Well, allow me to tell you a story. This is my family. My grandparents came here in search of a better life.
So I guess I'll just summarize what was in the video and then continue with the remainder of my talk. Thank you all for still being here. I don't know what's happening with the internet. I think I must have jinxed it by saying we wouldn't have any more technical difficulties. But I'll just keep going. So in the video that I tried to show you and that I will send you a link for, SAADA produced a video showing Rani Bagai, who is the granddaughter of Vaishno Das and Kala Bagai, who immigrated to the United States in 1914, some of the first Indian immigrants to immigrate to the United States, and they became US citizens. And then a 1923 Supreme Court case revoked the citizenship of Vaishno Das Bagai based on racial grounds. So the Supreme Court ruled that South Asian immigrants were not Aryans and therefore were not white and therefore could not be US citizens. So Vaishno Das Bagai, after having become a US citizen, and then having that citizenship revoked, winds up killing himself publicly as an act of protest. And in this video that SAADA produced in advance of the 2020 US presidential election, Rani Bagai, Vaishno Das's granddaughter, speaks at length about how important it is to vote and how it's a right that cannot be taken for granted, right? How it's a right that that at any point in time can be revoked and that we need to continue to fight for. So that's the video that I tried to show you. But in this brief video, Rani articulated, I think, a cyclical temporality, later echoed by Malik at the community meeting, that I think refuses the logic of white racial progress narratives. Progress is not a given. The granting of an ever-increasing number of rights is not inevitable. Rather, these messages communicate South Asian Americans did not always have these rights. Their ancestors fought for them. They could be rescinded. We might have to fight for them again. So in this view of history, oppressive histories repeat themselves. The threat of this repetition looms large. So in just 2 minutes, that video, which again, I'll send you the link for, counters white temporalities that assume the inevitability and desirability of a just post-racial future. Instead, we see a community weathering repeated attacks throughout history and using traces of the past to ward off the attack next time in the present, right? Drawing on records from corollary moments, in this case, the 1923 dismantling of citizenship rights to catalyze voter registration in 2020. So there's a temporal urgency to the past here and to archival activations of the past. So in each of these 3 cases, SAADA is drawing on what I call corollary records from corollary moments to catalyze political consciousness and action in the now. Corollary records document reoccurring moments in time in which the same or similar oppression gets repeated. A corollary moment is a point in time with historical precedence. At their most useful, records can be activated in corollary moments in the present so that community members can learn activist tactics and strategies and get inspiration to keep going. We've been here before. We've survived this before. We've resisted before, corollary records assert. Here's how. By activating corollary records, SAADA's community members are interrupting these reoccurring oppressions by learning from previous generations of community members facing corollary moments. This is one way archives can dismantle systemic oppression and engage in liberatory memory work, by catalyzing the activation of corollary records in the past to inspire and strategize activism in the present. These examples mark an important shift for the organization, a movement from collecting records for recuperative and representational purposes, what I would call a form of liberatory appraisal, towards using and encouraging others to use those records against oppression in what I would call liberatory activation. So in the initial years of working with SAADA, Malik, other volunteers, and I were stunned with the amount of material we found that dated back before 1965, when US immigration law changed to enable greater numbers of South Asians in the US. Back in 2008, when we founded SAADA, we had read about California's early Punjabi Mexican communities and heard rumors about a few anti-colonial activists along the west coast of the US and Canada from the turn of the 20th century. But really, we had no idea the wealth of records we would find once we really started to look. We feverishly collected as many pre-1965 records as we could find, thrilled to fill in some of the gaps and silences we found when we looked for South Asian American stories in mainstream repositories, like the US National Archives and dozens of university archives. Our initial aims were recuperative in the sense that we were trying to recuperate lost histories, pulling them back from oblivion into the community's consciousness. Our work was also representational in the sense that we were trying to increase the amount and types of representations of South Asians in the US stories about the past. Recuperative and representational collecting kept us busy for nearly a decade, and guided by a very broad appraisal policy, we discovered and digitized way more than we had ever anticipated about South Asian American history. Building on Duff and Harris's naming of liberatory description, I characterize these initial recuperative and representational collecting impulses as a form of liberatory appraisal. So appraisal is the process whereby archivists assign value to records, deciding what is important to keep, what is archival, what falls within organizational scope, and ultimately what also gets excluded or destroyed. So appraisal theory has preoccupied archival studies for a century, resulting in a host of theories, strategies, and tactics archivists employ to make appraisal decisions. Recently, I've proposed feminist standpoint appraisal as a type of liberatory appraisal that acknowledges the positionality of the appraiser and seeks to center the needs of those most disempowered due to the interlocking oppressions of white supremacy and hetero-patriarchy. In placing value in materials created by minoritized communities, in appraising them as worthy of retention and preservation, and in thinking about the affective, material, and political consequences of such decisions on the communities represented in such records, archivists engaged in representational and recuperative collecting, I think, can be said to engage in liberatory appraisal. Still, for SAADA staff and communities, representing Brown people in the US has never been enough, as important as it is. For years, Malik and community members have discussed how, if the archives only collected the records of the most prominent South Asian Americans, the collection would replicate the same forms of erasure it sought to combat. So what good would a South Asian American archives be if it only validated the experiences of straight, cis, upper caste men? Keenly aware of these archival silences, Malik consciously sought out collections created by South Asian American people and organizations further minoritized by gender, caste, sexuality, region, religion, ability, and class. Right, so it became increasingly clear over the years that for SAADA's collection to be inclusive of those most minoritized within South Asian American communities, we would have to think outside of the box of dominant Western archival appraisal, catalyzing the creation of new records rather than searching for pre-existing records to digitize alone. And in 2019, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, SAADA launched the Archival Creators Fellowship Program, which partnered with 3 fellows in its first round and 6 more in its second round to create archival collections that reflect the histories and perspectives of some of the most marginalized groups within South Asian American communities. So groups like Dalit women, Indo-Guyanese immigrants, and queer and trans people. Our initial twin impulses of recuperation and representation were motivated by what I would come to describe as countering symbolic annihilation with some representational belonging. By finding, digitizing, and providing access to as many records documenting the early history of South Asian Americans as we could, we were countering the community's symbolic annihilation in history, I think, with a powerful assertion of existence and belonging. So clearly, experiences of seeing yourself and your community in history after being excluded or misrepresented due to racism and hetero-patriarchy are emotionally powerful, right? Nearly every interview and focus group I've conducted with the volunteer staff users and donors to minoritized community-based archives over the past 5 years confirm the affective impact of robust representation after repeated and extended experiences of symbolic annihilation in mainstream archives. This affective impact, archives provoking this feeling of self-recognition in minoritized communities, can be an important emotional element of liberation. It's joyous to see yourself robustly represented after feeling symbolically annihilated. And this joy is inherently political in a system designed to oppress. But too often, I think, recuperative collecting projects fall into a trap of respectability that is ultimately counter to the aims of liberation. So a politics of respectability insists on collecting records that conform to dominant expectations about what a minoritized community should be. And this is true, I think, of many university-led projects that seek to recuperate the history of minoritized communities by documenting their firsts, right? The first politician from a given community, the first business leader, the first actor. Filling archives with celebratory success stories from prominent leaders, I think, can also reinforce harmful stereotypes that blame oppressed people for their own oppression. So many Asian American community archives, for example, can undergird model minority myths that thinly veil anti-Black racism. So such collections, whether they are in dominant or community-led archives, are about inclusion within oppressive structures rather than liberation from them. And I think they pander to dominant groups instead of resist domination. So given this complexity, many more representational collecting is not necessarily the result of liberatory appraisal, but it can be, right? And here's where there's a link, I think, between liberatory appraisal and liberatory activation. Liberatory appraisal, I think, considers the potential uses of records in making appraisal decisions and further asks whose might be using the records and for what aims. And in this way, liberatory appraisal is intimately tied to liberatory outreach, as it's only through the activation of records that their full liberatory potential can be realized, right? And the undergirding assumption of this is that archives can catalyze particular kinds of use, political use, artistic use, activist use, by modeling that use in their own practices and by targeting outreach efforts to groups engaged in liberatory work. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because we're pressed for time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this relationship between representation and liberation. It's not an either or, it can and should be both and, right? So community archives can and should counter symbolic annihilation through liberatory appraisal that robustly represents and recenters the needs of the most marginalized and vulnerable communities without extraction or exploitation. So recuperative and representational collecting efforts can provide important material to counter symbolic annihilation with representational belonging and change dominant narratives of dehumanization. But archives should not stop there, right? We can and should push for liberatory use and outreach, activating corollary records in our collections to stop cyclical oppressions in the now. Building archives around an acknowledgement of cyclical fluctuations in oppression and corresponding fluctuations in the desire, need, and ability to be recorded and archived is a direct challenge to the white temporalities on which dominant Western archival theory is based. So as described in my recent book, dominant Western archival theory fixes records in space and time, relying on a white temporal imaginary that posits time both as linear and progressive, in which the past precedes the present presages the future, and social conditions get better over time. In contrast, SAADA, like other community archives, reflects a cyclical rather than linear temporality, in which oppression either is repeated or can be repeated at any moment, in which records invoke corollary moments in the past and present, and records are collected in order to be activated to resist oppression in the now. So before I close, I want to say just a little bit about what archival studies can offer DH. I admit that it can be quite frustrating as an archival studies scholar to read DH work that reinvents the wheel when it comes to some core concepts and practices that archival studies scholars and archivists have been mulling over for decades. So archivists are not just technical experts, though we often do have that technical expertise. Our concepts, archival concepts like record, evidence, context, authenticity, value, can be key in your discussions as digital humanists, as are our words and concepts for core archival functions like creation, appraisal, selection, description, digitization, and preservation, all functions that you likely perform or rely on others performing as digital humanists. Archivists have also been thinking about representation, power, silences, and community engagement for a while now, although there's definitely much more work to do. Let's do this work together, right, instead of on parallel tracks. So definitely please, work with your university's archivist as an equal partner at the start of any DH project, but also read archival studies scholarship, take it seriously. Don't just think of us as helpers, but as thinkers with our own intellectual tradition. And conversely, I think archivists have so much to learn from digital humanities, right? Primarily, I think the most important lesson is that our digitization projects can make an argument that we're not just creating raw material for someone else to interpret, but that our projects are arguments in their own right. So with that in mind, I want to focus specifically on one area from archival studies that I think might be of use to you, and that's activation and use. So I have some questions I want to close with, but of course I want to hear questions from you. My questions are, who do you want to use your projects? Assuming they are not just intellectual exercises and they're not just for yourself, right? Which I know they're not. So how do you want your DH projects to be activated? To what ends? I think we need to make plans for the liberatory activation of digital projects in from the start. How can we use our skills to connect people to records in ways that liberate and repair rather than oppress and harm? And that's the question that I leave you with today. And again, massive apologies for the technical difficulties. And I'm so impressed that so many of you have stayed around through them. I have time for lots of questions now. And again, apologies. I can't see the questions in the chat, but if Brian or someone can help read them to me, thank you.
Hi, Michelle.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Dave.
If this were in person, you would right now hear a big round of applause for this talk, and you're on Zoom, so you can't hear that. But please know it's happening.
Thank you. Thank you all
and,
for bearing with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, of course. Yeah, and I too want to sort of underscore how impressed I am. How many people just hung around through that little technical difficulty? So thank you all. As we move to the Q&A, let me encourage everyone to think about a question and throw it into the Q&A chat box on the bottom of your screen. I can see we already got a few of them in there. I got a few over in my notes. So Michelle, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to sort of curate these questions for you.
Great.
Brian's been having some computer trouble too, so we don't want to lose that. So here's the first one. How do we get these marginalized communities to learn and work about the archives that benefit them?
Well, I think that we should be doing this work all alongside them, with them, for them from the very start, right? So that the work should not be separate from community members, but should engage with them at again, the initial phases, right? So when you're figuring out what is the project? What am I doing? What am I digitizing? What am I collecting? What's the argument I'm making? I think we should be in constant conversations with the communities that our work is trying to represent and ultimately serve, right? So initially asking what kinds of projects would be of use to the community, so that it's not an afterthought, but that it's baked into the project from the start. So asking and listening, and particularly listening when your own research question or your own research interests do not align with those of community groups, right? So we might come in as researchers with all kinds of ideas, and being really opening, I think, to hearing those are not the right questions. You're not asking the right questions. Ask these other questions that are of more import to us. Is a
We may have lost Michelle again. Hopefully this time will be a little quicker.
really, really important of communities that I see is important. Working. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We lost you for a second, but I think we got you back.
I'm here, right? So, from the start, involving community. So it's not just a matter of outreach at the end. It's work that is done with communities from the start.
So here's a great follow-up. I don't know that this was intended as a follow-up because they're from actually they're from Anonymous, so I can't tell, but it seems like a follow-up. The question is, what does community outreach as an archivist look like? Are there ways to get involved with local mutual aid through archivist work?
Yes, absolutely. So outreach can look all kinds of ways, right? So prior to the pandemic, SAADA would have a lot of events, right? So Sameep, other staff members, we have this amazing outreach coordinator, Mariam, would organize public events around all kinds of themes, right? So they might be, an event just to learn more about the history of the organization or the history of South Asian Americans in a particular community. Or we had a grant a few years ago where we commissioned South Asian American artists to create new artwork based on material in the archives. And then we had a very public unveiling of that work in Philadelphia. There are also walking tours of Philadelphia that's organized by SAADA, South Asian American History. There's another group, friends of ours, who run the Berkeley Radical South Asian American History Walking Tour of Berkeley, right? So there are all kinds of ways that we can activate the archive. I was so impressed. Something that Sameep was doing right now is he commissioned 3 South Asian American designers to create, he's calling it merch, but as far as I know, t-shirts based on materials in the archive. He put out a social media call asking for people to model the new designs. And then there's going to be a Zoom meeting in which the new designs of these t-shirts and maybe other merchandise, I'm not sure yet, that is inspired by material in the archive will be unveiled, right? Right. So trying to find the organization also just published a book called Our Stories, which is a massive, like 400-page textbook that is meant for South Asian American high school students. And it's organized by different themes, right? So there's a theme on South Asian Americans and sports and South Asian Americans in the spelling bee, right? So again, bringing in all kinds of people who might not necessarily think that they're interested in archives. Or that many archivists who work for dominant institutions like universities or government archives, when they think about doing outreach events, it's usually like, oh, we have lots of historians. Why don't we try to bring in the anthropologists too? I think community-based archives from the start think much more broadly about who might use their archives. I love that this question involved the concept of mutual aid association. So there's a group of us who came together right before. We're in the process of envisioning this, but it would be a kind of mutual aid association for community-based archivists to share skills with each other, right? So we had a professional fundraiser come and talk to us about fundraising. We had a journalist come to talk to us about marketing our stories to journalists. And that was super helpful, right? And so I think we need that kind of action to share skills, but also, and most importantly, to advocate for more funding for community archives, right? So it's only very recently that any kind of major funders were interested in funding community-based archives. It's been a really uphill struggle. Now the Mellon Foundation for the past 3 years has directly funded community-based archives, but we need many more funders to understand how important it is to give money directly to community organizations and not to university collecting projects in which a very small portion of the overall grant might trickle down, trickle down to a community organization, but to rather directly support those community-based archives, I think is really important.
So given the advent of things like Mellon funding for community archives, given things like the cultural cachet of digital storytelling, do you think we live in an archival moment?
I guess I'd have to think more about that. I have to think like what moments are not archival moments. But I think in some ways, we're really interested in archives now, right? In ways that perhaps we weren't before. Part of it is like the use and misuse of the term more broadly in the humanities, right? The use of the archive as a metaphor. So lots of people are very interested in the archive. But I think we're also at a unique moment in which the materiality of the archive is crashing. It's really crashing with this broader notion of the archive as this immaterial concept, right? So in some ways we produce more records than we have ever produced. They're all digital records, right, that we're producing. I can't tell you, the number of emails when my internet is working, the number of emails I get on a daily basis. Those are all records, right? The number of websites that I visit every day. But at the same time, we're producing so many records, but we don't have the space and the platforms and the expertise to preserve them all, right? So we don't know how many of those emails or how many of those websites are going to be around. Many of them are in corporate platforms, right, which are not archives. They exist to make a profit, right? So, I hear often from community-based archives who say things like, oh yeah, we have a digital archive, it's on Instagram. Like, that's not an archive, right? Unfortunately, it's a collection of material, but it's a collection of material, however important it is, that to you might not exist for much longer, will only exist in as much as it's profitable for the company, right, to maintain it. So on the one hand, we have absolute abundance, and yet there might be a scarcity decades from now when people are interested in seeing this material. Also, if we're not able to preserve everything digitally. If we were, it would be useless, right? There has to be some kind of culling happening. But that culling, I think, should be done really thoughtfully, done by community-based archives, for example, and not by large corporations.
Perfect. That's actually a perfect lead into this next question. I have two more for you, just to let you know. And actually, in all honesty, just so everyone knows, between the chat and the Q&A box, I have more questions than I can possibly get through in the next couple minutes. So I'm going to do my best to combine them and sort of do my best to get as many as possible into these next two. So Marianne McGraham, professor of English here at KU, starts by saying, thank you for calling out the issue of symbolic annihilation. And then she goes on to note that part of what we might think of as an archival turn here, or as part of this cachet of digital storytelling, is that there are some persistent dangers in this process. And she lists things like tokenism, opportunism, irresponsible stewardship, exploitation, and all of these, of course, have been around a long time.
Yep.
So she's thinking, she wants to ask, what strategies would you suggest for offsetting the repetition of these issues?
Ooh, can you repeat the issues again that you named? So
Tokenism,
yep,
opportunism,
yep,
irresponsible stewardship, and
yes,
exploitation.
yes, such important issues, right? I think again, it's about first of all, acknowledging that there is you're arriving, if you work for a university, you're arriving at any table with a community-based organization unequally, right? That you are representing an institution that has very often profited from extracting and harming minoritized communities, and you carry with you that legacy and ongoing reality, right? So being absolutely aware from the start that you're entering into this partnership or relationship in a power position. And I think being very, very clear and formal about how to mitigate that inequity from the very start, right? So thinking about formalizing check-ins, for example. So if you're working with a community partner, you might say every 3 months, we're going to check in with each other. And we're going to have a meeting and you're going to tell me what I'm doing wrong. Right? You're going to tell me what I'm doing right. And it might not be easy for me to hear, but I need to hear that. And I'm going to make changes as a result of that. Right? So that's one thing that I think is really important. The second, I think, is involving the organization's community groups from the start in your projects, and doing it not just in terms of research questions and conception, which is absolutely important, but also in terms of funding. Right? I've heard from so many community archives about academics who apply for grants, get really large grants that involve some kind of face-to-face meetings or participation from the community group. And the community group has never even seen the grant proposal from the start, right? Let alone the budget, right? So the most important thing that community archives need, when I talk to across the board, the most important thing is money, right? Resources. So making sure that they are part of any grant process from the start, that they've seen the budget, that they have an adequate part of the budget, that they agree to the budget, that you're very crystal clear about resources, right? And how those resources are going to be shared. I think also in the dominant Western academic tradition, we're trained to think about consent as like a one-time transaction. Like, if I'm doing an interview with a community member, I have a consent form that's been approved by the Institutional Review Board. I'm going to get you to sign it, and then we're done. Whereas I think the beauty of community archives is they reflect the values of their communities, and often consent there is seen as an ongoing relationship that gets negotiated and renegotiated constantly. So it's great if you might have that form that's signed that your IRB approved. But more importantly, you need to be constantly checking in, right, about your project and making sure that communities are approving the work that you're doing. And to me, that kind of community approval is much more important than IRB approval from my institution, although of course I need that too in order to get started. Another thing that's really important is transparency, right? So a lot of community groups don't know about academic tenure and promotion processes, right? They don't know what you're getting out of doing this kind of work. And so I think just being really upfront and honest about why you're doing the kind of work, what the benefits are to you, what the harms are to you if you're an academic, and just being absolutely transparent as well. It's a lot. It's a lot, right? And I think also never resting on your laurels, right? Constantly asking yourself and community partners, is this project tokenistic? Is this extractive? Asking, what am I giving back? What am I giving back? I know what I'm getting out of this project for my own academic career, but what am I giving back? I think is really key.
I love that so much. One more question for you here, and I think this is spurred by a comment from Claudia Salas, and I think it's actually a question rather, that connects unspeakable archives to urgent archives, and the question is about how do you take digital records and transform them into activism in the 21st century? I think if I'm following your terms correctly, that might be a question about moving from liberatory appraisal to liberatory activation.
Yeah. So we can use the tools at our disposal, the digital tools, to get people to interact with the records and to activate the records, right? So that that article that I showed you about HD Mudgull, that's from a blog post, right? So not, you know, a very recent technology, but in the grand scheme of things, a recent technology, right? We can use social media platforms, right? So things like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, right? To get people to interact with the records. And we do that. SAADA does that, right? So whenever we have a new blog post, we send blasts out through social media so that people are aware. But first streets named after a South Asian American woman in the United States. So like that's an amazing activation of a record, right? That they first encountered this record online in SAADA because I digitized it alone in my office at night thinking, why am I doing this kind of work, right? And then 5 years later, somebody interacts with it online, gets inspired, gets so inspired by the story that they effectively lobby the Berkeley City Council to rename a street. That's amazing, right? And now there are huge banners on that street with Kalabagai's picture. We're hoping that, you know, South Asian American young people can see themselves, feel more of a part of the city when they see that street name and investigate more about South Asian American history after seeing that street name. But I also think we need to do more than that, right? So it's great to see Kalabagai Way. It's emotional as someone who worked on the records. It's really emotional, I think, for many South Asian Americans. But it would be merely representational, right? If that street still enacted all of the forms of oppression that all streets in the United States do, right? So I think we need to rejoice in seeing Kalabagai Way, but let's make Kalabagai Way a liberated zone, right? Let's like abolish policing on Kalabagai Way. Let's really activate the records to go beyond representation, even though that is super important, but also for liberation, right? To actually dismantle these oppressive systems rather than just fight for inclusion within them or more representation within them.
I love that call, Michelle, to both representation and liberation, that we need to do both of those. We'll end with that. Michelle, I don't know if you can see the chat on your phone, but it's filled with little hands clapping.
Oh, thank you.
So we are so grateful that you've taken the time to be with us, and we look forward to having you in Lawrence in person sometime.
Yes, and I am so sorry about the technical difficulties, and I'm so grateful for those of you who stuck around. I really, really appreciate that you stuck around through this.
Sounds good. Thank you, Michelle. We'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
for
thank
attending.
you.